Ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce to you one of motorcycling's all-time greats. He has travelled from his home in the Isle of Man to be with us this evening. Accompanied now with his wife and Pendennis Club President John Stone, will you please give a great welcome to 6 times World Road Racing Motorcycle Champion, Geoff Duke, OBE.
Good evening, all. Your Honour, the Mayor. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight. Members and friends of the Pendennis Club. Can I say a welcome to Geoff Duke and his wife Daisy from us all in Parliament Hall. I would like to start from reading a little bit of the history of the show from tomorrow's programme. For those of you who don't know anything about the Pendennis Club, long before Japanese bikes dominated the motorcycle market, British were supreme. Norton, ASA, New Imperial, Scott and Excelsior were a few of the sought-after machines for the enthusiast. Along with the success of British motorcycle industry came the birth of the Pendennis Motor Club in 1930, essentially formed by a group of then Falmouth area young men to promote road races round the Pendennis point from which it took its name. Crowds gathered in their thousands between 1931 and 1936 to watch fearless riders wrestle their two-wheeled bucking machines around this cliff-top circuit, some with a sidecar attached. Up to 40 riders would take part, including some of the top names in racing. George Rowley, who competed in the Isle of Man TT races and was a works ADS rider, took the checkered flag here twice. After the County Council purchased the Cliff Road from the War Department and designated it a public road in 1937, it no longer echoed to the sound of open pipes on the Megan. However, despite this major setback, the club continued to thrive and a team of display riders performed throughout the county during the summer months, monies raised being donated to local charities. The club took part in Falmouth's Flora Festival Rally, not only now as a normal motorcycle club, but with cars like Morgan, Wolsey and Singer. Pendennis continues to keep the Flora name alive in that during the spring of each year, we run the Flora Road Trial. And later tonight we'll give the awards for that trial. During the war years, the club took a low profile and became a social club. With the loss of many of its enthusiastic young members who never returned, the club ran down. This reached an all-time low during the early 1950s with a membership of just 3, and thank God for those 3. Since then, the club has grown to become very healthy with a membership of over 100. Tonight, we have here with us from the days of racing at Castle Drive, the starter, Mr. Endine, Pitts Marshals, Mr. Coward and Mr. Timberwoods, racers, Freddie Hawkins, Morris and Eric Nichols, Rancher Stevens and Stuart Wall. Gentlemen, can I ask you to stand up so that we all recognise you? Before I pass the mic to our guest, can I ask our youngest, probably our prettiest member, Stacey Bennett, to come forward friendly little memento to Daisy too. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the King of Two Wheels, Geoff.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for such a wonderful reception. I didn't really expect quite so many people here tonight. Excuse me, actually the crediting I did was, I don't know, about 27 years ago. But I'll try to remember some of the highlights, and afterwards, any of you would like to ask any specific questions, and I'll do my best to answer. Anyway, my racing career really kicked off when I was a dispatch rider instructor during the war, and I met people like Hugh Viney, who one or two people may remember. He was the sergeant I was attached to, the senior instructor, and I also had a very enjoyable couple of weeks in the Lake District on an instructor's refresher course under Freddie Pritt of all people. So you can imagine that my appetite was whetted very early on in the piece. Anyway, to cut that part of the story short, I left the army and immediately bought myself a trials PSA and started. In fact, one of my first trials was the West of England trial, which I got the 350 Cup in. And then I managed to, shall we say, persuade the Ergo of PSAs to give me a job at PSA in the engine development department. I carried on riding in trials with no great thoughts of road racing at that time, although previously I'd been quite keen to try my hand at this. And then, quite out of the blue, Hugh Viney got in touch with me. He was then competition manager of trials, the main man of the team for AGS and Matchless. He got in touch with me and asked me if I would go and ride for AGS and Matchless in trials. And this interested me not only because it was an opportunity of rejoining Hugh, but also with AGS having such a background in racing, because I still had this slight hope that I might be able to do something in this line. I went down to Plumstead. Hugh took me around the factory and introduced me to Les Graham, who was in charge of the racing department at that time. And I happened to mention to Les that I'd like to ride in the Clubman's TT. And he immediately said to me, I'm sorry, the directors wouldn't even consider that if you come and work here, because people would say it's something fiddle that you've got a works machine, and they just wouldn't wear it at all, which was obviously quite a disappointment to me. So on my return to Birmingham, where I was in digs at that time, there was a letter waiting for me from a gentleman by the name of Artie Bell, who was then the main man in the Northern racing team. And I'd met Artie prior to this time at the Scott trial, where we'd been having a look around sections with Bill Nicholson, another very famous name, the day before. And in this letter, Artie said that he'd been very impressed with my riding, and that he and Rex McCandless had produced this new Norton Trials machine, 500T as it was called, and would I be interested, he'd mentioned it to Joe Craig, would I be interested in joining the Norton Trials team? Well, this of course was, Norton's and racing was on the back of my mind straight away. And I then had the, shall we say, the unpleasant task of getting back to Hugh Viney and saying, well, I'm sorry, but I'm not going down to Plumstead, I'm going to Norton instead. And Hugh did fall out with me for a while after that. But I met Joe for the first time with a friend of mine who was in the army with me, Charles Markham, and agreed to go and ride for them in trials and to work in what was this very small competition department. And I mentioned at the same time that I was interested in riding in the Clubman's TT. This was in 1948. And to my delight and surprise, Joe Craig said, yes, sure, we'd be only too pleased if you did. So anyway, again, to cut a long story short, I put this entry in for the Clubman's in 48, but it was turned down because, first of all, I hadn't had any racing experience at all at that time, and secondly, the entry was oversubscribed. So the only thing to do then was to have a go at the Manx. So I got myself a 350 Manx Northern, and went over a week before the event, put the entry in, which was accepted. I'm afraid it wouldn't be in this day and age because I literally had never ridden in the road race of any race other than a scramble of any kind at that time. Anyway, I went over, as I say, a week before, and with my trials bike and wandered around the circuit, stopped and looked and did my best to learn the sequence of bends and such like. In practice, I made a point of not revving the engine at all, but just concentrating on learning my way around. And the net result of that was that I think my fastest lap was something like 33 minutes, and certainly not in the top of the pecking order anyway. And of course I started in the race. I think I only managed to get a bit attendant the night before the race, and I'd no one to help me at all preparing the bike. Started the race completely oblivious to what was likely to happen because I'd got no idea even of my own potential. And people like Dennis Parkinson, who had won the race before, was riding in the junior Manx. And of course my signals were only given at the pits, so literally I was working a lap behind, so to speak. Anyway, at the end of the second lap, I was given a signal to the effect that I was lying third, and then the following lap I was lying second, and then I stopped at the pit stop for fuel, filled the bike up, and in those days it was inevitable that the engine was consuming a certain amount of oil, so oil was put in the oil tank. Immediately I restarted. I got down to not Quarterbridge to Braddon Bridge, and the bike went into a bit of a slide. And I thought, oh dear, it's put too much oil in the oil tank, and the fuel, the oil was coming out and going over the back tyre. So anyway, I being young, I pressed on, irrespective of that. And I got to Ballacrane, and I slid right across the road, almost into the wall there. So this did detune me somewhat. And I took it easy as far as Ramsey, and by which time the oil seemed to have disappeared off the back tyre, and I started to have a go again. About halfway up the mountain mile, the engine suddenly seized. And I pulled into the side, and of course then I realised that the oil tank was split, and in fact, the tank hadn't been overfull, it had virtually run out of oil altogether. I got off the bike and walked up to the mountain box, spoke to the marshal there, and he said, oh, what number are you? I said, number 12. Oh, what a pity, he said, you were leading the race. Which was, in many ways, a great disappointment, but at the same time, I was really so surprised myself that I'd gone so well, and so delighted that the blow of actually stopping really didn't bother me overnight. This may sound a bit strange, but still. Anyway, from then onwards, well, yes, one interesting point about that. Apparently, Joe Craig, who always came over to the Manx to see if there was any up-and-coming talent in the Manx Grand Prix he could include in the Northern team the following year, went out on the circuit with a Dr. Steve Derbyshire, who had done well in the Manx previously, who was a friend of his, and a friend of mine, incidentally, went out to Union Mills. And according to Steve Derbyshire, later on, he said, I came through Union Mills on the first lap. You reckon my handlebars were scraping the ground? It was that far over. And apparently Joe's eyebrows shot up, and he decided that he'd like to have another place. and they went to the inside of the circuit to round this corner. And it took them a couple of laps to get there, so it was, I just started the fourth lap, in fact, when they arrived. And Joe went up to the marshal and said, has number 12 come round yet? And the marshal said, yes, he has, but he won't really want to come round again. Apparently, I died around the outside of someone there, very highly dangerous speed, this marshal reckoned, and I wouldn't last much longer. And of course, the strange part being that I didn't come round again, but not for the reason which the marshal thought. Anyway, really the next race of any consequence which I rode in was the Clubman's TT the following year. And I rode an international norm, in that. And I managed to win it at record speed. And it was after that race that the managing director of Norton's came up to my digs, just off the promenade in Douglas, and offered me a place in the works team. And when I look back now, I actually said, well, no thank you, I don't think I've had enough experience, but if you'd like to make the offer later on, I'd be only too pleased to accept. And to have just sort of brushed off the managing director of Norton, just like that, when I look back, was a bit much, really. But I really did feel that I hadn't got enough experience. And really this held me in good stead, because I rode in the Manx the same year, and I unfortunately, half dropped it at avoiding the back of a rider in AGS at Ramsey Derby, and managed to get going again without a rear brake and with a clutch which was barely freeing at all, and finished second from McCandless. And then I managed to turn the tables on him in the senior and won the senior Manx Grand Prix. And after that, Geoff Smith did come again and say, there was a place for me in the Northern team. And the first outing I had with Northern's was at Montlhéry, where in October of that year we were having a go at collecting some 500 world records. And with me was Artie Bell and Eric Oliver, who normally rode sidecar, but was also a very good solo man. And it was there that I had one lesson, learned one lesson. During our practice session before, Montlhéry is an absolutely flat-out circuit. But of course the bike we were using was unstreamlined. And Artie Bell, in spite of being bigger than me, was lapping about half, three-quarters of a second quicker than I was, consistently, which just didn't seem right until Joe pointed out that my leathers didn't fit as well as Artie's did. So with some tape, we take back the excess of leather on the sleeves and also on the leg. And immediately I was lapping at exactly the same speed as Artie. And it was this which gave me the idea of having virtually skin-tight leathers, and also from the point of view of comfort and lightness, so that there wasn't a lot of ruck of leather around the middle, was to have a one-piece suit made. And I went back to my hometown, St Helens, and went to the people who made my leathers and asked them, would they do this? And they said yes, they would have a go, but they'd need a patent. So I then went to my local tailor in St Helens, and he said yes, he would make a patent up. And yes, he did. But then when I went back to him, he said, this is quite interesting. He said, I'd like to have a go at making these leathers for you. And anyway, he did this, and there was a bit of trial and error involved, obviously. But he produced a pair of leathers which literally weighed ounces. I mean, if I'd really fallen off in a big way, I would have been very hurt, that's for sure. But they certainly were skin tight, and had a separate lining, which I got made by some people who make these ballet outfits, which I got ripped quite a bit about by other riders later on. But anyway, I'd obviously decided that if one-piece close-fitting leathers, well, close-fitting leathers could be a benefit at Montlhéry, then they must be a benefit also in road racing, perhaps not to the same extent, but to some measure anyway. And this, in fact, turned out to be the case. And now, of course, as you've probably noticed, no one wears two-piece leathers anymore, and most of them are very, very well fitted. So that was another little plus on my part. Anyway, then of course I started racing seriously with Northlands, but unfortunately, well, things went quite well to start with. The 350 race, I finished second to Artie Bell in the junior. There was nothing I could do about that. I had no problems, but Artie just went quicker than I did. And in the senior, the situation was reversed, and I managed to win the senior with Artie finishing second. And then we went off to the continent, and then our troubles really started. Belgian Grand Prix, I was leading, and about three-quarters of the way through the race, after having had a big battle with Pagani, Van der Rohe and Rossetti, all on Galeras, also Galeras, in the early stages, and I finally managed to get away from Rossetti. I think I had about three-quarters of a minute lead when there was this very loud bang, and most of the tread came off the rear tire. And of course, this inevitably meant that I had to retire, which was, needless to say, very upsetting, as it was my first Continental Grand Prix. Then, in about 10 days' time, we were due to practice for the Dutch TT. And of course, there were the problems with the tyres. There were some special tyres flown over. The company, I won't mention names, did say that they knew what the problem was and that these tyres would be okay. And I spoke to the competition manager who was with us in Holland before practice even and said, now look, these are going to be all right, are they? Because, you know, it's a matter of life and limb. They said, oh yes, I'm sure they'll be okay. Anyway, 350 race went off okay. I went out to the 500 and it was the same old story, slipstreaming the fours. And I was in Rossetti's slipstream and just come out of a long line of trees both sides of the road, lying in second place, when once again there was a big bang, and this time the tread brought the rear chain off and locked the back wheel. And I went down the road literally on the front wheel like this. In fact, Les Graham, who was following me, said that the only contact I had with the bike was my hands on the handlebars. I was up here and the bike was about there. Fortunately, they cut down a lot of trees and removed them completely, virtually from the point where this happened. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have been ridden off. But I got thrown onto the grass verge, and the bike finished up in the ditch. It was a complete write-off. And the only obvious damage, as far as I was concerned, was that I got a cut on the back of my leathers, which in turn had cut my back a bit, but not seriously. And everything seemed okay until the following morning when I tried to get out of bed. I was absolutely rigid. I think I must have pulled every muscle in my body actually as I was rolling down the side of the road. So it was then that Havens came forward and said that they developed a new racing tyre and would Joe Craig be interested to go down and watch it on test against the opposition. And Norton decided then, after those tests, which were so conclusive, that they would use Havens. And literally, as a tyre company, they went from strength to strength until they virtually had every works team in about 1957 running on their tyres. And in fact, they were the first people to produce the sort of sticky compounds which one sees now in these slip tyres and in the Formula One car world. Havens were the very first people to produce synthetic rubbers at that time. Anyway, 50 had started fairly, obviously very well at the TT, not so well at the Belgian and Dutch, by which time Rossetti had a fairly demanding regional world championship. We then went to Geneva and we used Pirelli tyres there because there was nothing else available and it rained. And I think we all had terrible rides. I finished fourth, I think I was second and third in the 350 and fourth in the 500. Galeras just cleared up once again. And then we went to look, while we were there, we went to look at Monza to see whether it was even worth going there because it was such a fast circuit. And we decided, you know, it was worth having a go. And We went to the Ulster, I won the senior Ulster, and then went to Monza and had once again a terrific battle with Mazzetti, and eventually got the better of him, mainly because the Northern Camp was so much better than the Gilera in those days. And I managed to win the 500 race there. So that meant with both 350 and 500 classes, I was runner-up in the World Championship. And I was only 1 point, in fact, at the finish behind Mazzetti on the Gilera, which really, for the first year of serious road racing, was very pleasing, shall we say. Anyway, in winter of between 1950 and 51, a lot of development was done on the 350 because prior to that, the Bellaset with Bob Foster on board had been all concrete. He won the World Championship in the 350 class in 50, and the North just weren't competitive at all. But a man by the name of Neil Kosmicki, who used to lecture on internal combustion engines at Warsaw University, of all places, just before the war, joined Norton's. And in fact, he joined Norton's. He was in the Free Polish Air Force during the war. He joined Norton's literally to sweep the floors in the factory. And it was one of the mechanics who happened to be talking to him one day and discovered that he, in fact, had a very great knowledge of internal combustion engines. And he went and told Joe Craig about it, and Joe interviewed him, and the next thing is that he was in the racing department instead of sweeping the floor. And he was given the job of developing the 350 engine. And between the end of that one season and the beginning of the next season, he lifted the horsepower of the engine from, I think it was 28 horsepower. I know it doesn't sound very much now, but that was reasonable horsepower for 350 in those days. From 28 horsepower to 36 horsepower in one winter. And it completely turned the tables on the Bellasets. And of course, it meant that I had a wonderful time the following year, because the 500 was always pretty competitive, except in the Continental Grand Prix against the Fords. But the 350 was absolutely unbeatable. And I won both junior and senior TTs and both World Championships. But the writing was on the wall a bit, because in both the Belgian and the Dutch, I had some very, very hard rides. In fact, the Belgian Grand Prix, the senior Belgian, I, looking back now, realised was the race of my life. It was the one race in which I literally rode on my personal limit from the drop of the flag at the beginning to the drop of the flag at the end. And we were very fortunate in this respect, because the Gileras were getting more and more competitive. And at that time we were using 80-octane fuel, which is of course even below what the 2-star is now. And Nortons didn't run too well on this, even on 80-octane fuel. They were comparatively low compression, whereas the Gileras just revelled in it, no problems at all. But fortunately for us, at that particular race, the Gulf company provided the fuel, and they must have slipped in something better than 80-octane. We didn't know about this in advance, but we soon discovered it because the engines were running so cool in practice. And we were able to take compression plates out and put smaller jets in, such like, which made the bikes much more competitive. And in fact, from memory, I think I was just about the fastest in practice, but only by a fraction of a second. And I discussed race tactics with Joe the night before. We had a walk down from the hotel, which is in the village of Stavelot, down to Stavelot Corner and back, which we often did, discussing tactics. And I said, look, you know, don't bother giving me any signals at all, because in the Belgian in those days, you came out of a line of trees, a very short straight section, then you went into Francorchamps hairpin, a right-hand hairpin, and then downhill past the pits. And you could, in fact, control the race if you were capable of doing it, just literally by looking back as you came out of the hairpin. So I said, don't bother to give me any signals at all. But the thing I must do is make the best start I've ever made. Because if I once get mixed up with these Fords and I'm slipstreaming, there's no way I'm I'm going to beat them with their superior speed. But if I can get away first, and if I can hold that lead to Francorchamps hairpin on the first lap, I can then, hopefully, control the race and just forget about signals. Anyway, I did make the best start of my life. And as we dived into the Orange Bridge, which is just after the start, I was in the lead, and I managed to maintain that lead right up to the hairpin. And as I came out of the hairpin, I think it was Gimignani on the twin Moto Guzzi actually was just going into the hairpin, and Milani was just behind him. And literally on the next lap, he was 2 or 3 yards farther back. On the next lap, 2 or 3 more yards farther back, and so it went on. But all the time, I was having to ride right on the limit. And I was looking at some old film actually the other day, which showed me going around Stavelot, which was a long sweeping right-hander, which is just about flat out in top on the north. And you can see that both front and rear wheels are actually drifting slightly around there. And I suppose that would be around 130 miles an hour, which wasn't exactly hanging about in those days, although it's nothing, of course, now. So anyway, as I said, the writing was on the wall then. We went to the Dutch. I had the same problems, but just managed to win. The Ulster was held under atrocious conditions, pouring with rain, but I managed to win that. And then, of course, we went to Monza again, and this time there was no question. I mean, the drop of the flag, the Gilera was just cleared off, in particular Milani, and the best I could do was to finish 4th. So things were looking pretty bad. Anyway, in the meantime, Norton's had realised that they had to come up with a multi, but they were desperately short of money and short of technical people to do anything about it. But what they did was to get on to the BRM people and ask them to design a water-cooled 4-cylinder engine which they could use in the McCandless featherbed frame. And they'd in fact set all this in motion, probably a couple of years before, but it had drifted on, and I think most of the money they put into it probably went into the BRM car anyway. And the BRM people came to the factory a couple of times with basic designs, and they were sent away. Well, in the first instance, they just seemed to have forgotten that it had to go into a motorcycle frame, and there were various other glaring problems with the thing. And eventually, Norton took over and decided that they would try to redesign the engine in their own design department. Anyway, in the meantime, we were struggling on with the single cylinders. And of course, 52, the rock really set in there. The TT, unfortunately, I won the 350, but on the 500 when I was leading, little tin race in the clutch broke up. And when I stopped the fuel, I'd been able to carry on changing it without the clutch. When I stopped the fuel, of course, I couldn't restart the engine, so that put me out of the 500 race. And then we went to the continent, and whereas I'd just won the Belgian and Dutch before, I just lost them this time, and this was really the writing on the wall. And then, being rather worn out anyway, I went to a race at Schotten in Germany, which was an international event but not a world championship one, on the 350. And I hardly did any practice. It was a very difficult circuit to learn. It was about 11 or 12 miles round. In practice, I had a wasp sting on my arm, which prevented me from doing most of the practice. Fortunately, there wasn't much opposition in the actual race, but I think Rayan was riding Mount Norton in it, and he was lying second with, I think, a couple of laps to go, and I was given a signal to slow down. Now, this was something, if I was ever given that sort of signal, which didn't happen very often, I used to just change up earlier, rather than, in other words, take it more easy on the engine, but still ride in the same way, because I was always afraid of losing concentration. And anyway, I'd had a few very difficult races, and I made the cardinal mistake on that day of actually relaxing myself. And as a result, I got 2 corners crossed up, consecutive corners. One was flat in third, and the other was flat in top. and I went into the platinum third or the platinum top, and I very nearly got away with it, but unfortunately I caught my footrest and foot on a straw bale which was propped against a tree, and this of course just spun the bike round, which finished in the ditch, and I finished in the ditch with a very badly dislocated ankle, which put me out of racing for the rest of the year, and was, needless to say, very painful. Anyway, this, because things were so, becoming so difficult, when Gilbert Smith came to see me when I was recuperating at home in Southport to see about 1953 season, I asked him about the four-cylinder, how that was going on. And for once, it wasn't dangled like a carrot. He said, oh no, there's no chance of getting it for 53, but we're still working on it. So I said, well, I'm sorry, but I don't mind riding something with a future, but I'm just not interested in riding something that only has a past. And I'm afraid he took a very poor view of this, and left in a high dudgeon, as you might say. And I really decided there and then that I was going to change to cars. And I'd been driving an Aston Martin in one or two races during 1952, as well as riding bikes. And I had the opportunity of signing a contract with David Brown with Aston Martin for 53, which I took up. And then I was talked into, by Graham Walker actually, into riding in at Silverstone Saturday, which was motorcycling day. He was the editor of the book Motorcycling. He said he could get me works north. As it turned out on the day, the bikes that turned up, the one that turned up in practice was an Aubrey Manx North, which had literally been built overnight. And the 500 didn't turn up till race day. And the 350 wasn't going very well because it hadn't been properly set up, obviously, being brand new. And I discovered later what had happened, that Craig had instructed the race department to prepare two bikes for me. And Ken Kavanagh, who was then the #1 man in the team, who walked into the race department and discovered that these bikes were being done for me, went straight into Gilbert Smith's office and threatened to tear up his contract if I got works bikes for Silverstone. So the net result, the only way out as far as Norton was concerned, was to build two Manx bikes, but they didn't tell me anything about it. Anyway, the 500, the 350 wasn't going well, the 500 arrived on race day, and Graham Walker came to me and said, look, I can get you a lap, you can do one lap on the 500 if you like, if you'll ride it. So I said, no thank you, no way. So this 350 isn't going very well, but I'll ride that, but I'm not going to ride it at a virtually untried bike. Anyway, I rode the 350, and I think it was one of the lowest positions ever. I finished in, I was 7th in the 350 race. But I was encouraged by a chap called Tom Joy, who was the development engineer with Aidens, who was very good with a stopwatch. And one of Tom's pastimes was to time riders from a point approaching a corner to a point exiting a corner. He came up to me afterwards and said, look, don't worry about being 7th because you were, whatever it was, 2/5 of a second quicker than anyone round Stoke Corner consistently, so you haven't lost your touch. So that was encouraging, and I must admit I did really enjoy the ride. And then later, Graham Walker got on to me again and said, look, would you ride in the TT? And I can get you works north. So I said, well, if you said you could get me works north before, oh yes, I'm sure I can this time. So anyway, I said, well, I would ride in the TT, but I certainly won't ride in any of the Continental Grand Prix. So he said, well, leave it with me. So he came back to me and said, Gilbert Smith is ill in bed at home at the moment. Could you call on the way down to Silverstone, because I was driving Aston Martin at Silverstone, could I call and see him at his home? So I went down, called there, shown up at his bedroom, and we talked for about half an hour about everything except racing and joining the Norton team. It was never mentioned. And I'd said to Graham Walker that Gilbert Smith would have to ask me to ride. I wasn't going to ask him. Anyway, he didn't ask me, and I didn't ask him. I eventually said, hope you're soon better, and away I went to Silverstone. The following day was practice day. I practiced with the Aston Martin, and I was a bit unsure about Abbey Corner, so I had a walk down to Abbey, and I met one of the marshals who I knew down there, and he said, "Oh, have you seen the Birmingham Mail this morning, Geoff?" So I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Oh, there's an interesting piece from Gilbert Smith in there." So he said, "I'll go and get it." And he produced this paper, and in it said that Duke had gone to see Gilbert Smith to plead for a place in the Northern team, but Gilbert Smith had said there was no place in the team for him. And which absolutely shattered me, needless to say, because there's no such thing as happened. He obviously picked up the phone the moment I left and produced this concoction. So, of course, I was very annoyed about it, to say the least. I drove the Aston. I had problems with that. I spun on someone else's oil. And on the way back home, I was still thinking what I should do. And I'd had an offer from Gilera in 1950, at the end of the 1950 season, which I turned down because I was very patriotic and I wanted to continue to ride Normans at that time. And I'd had a second offer through a friend called Austin Monk, who was very friendly with both Gilera and Motor Guzzi, also at the end of the 52 season. And anyway, I stopped at a call box and rang up Austin and said, do you think Gilera would still be interested in me riding for them? He said, "Well, I think so. Leave it with me and I'll come back to you." Monday morning, he came back on the phone and said, yes, they were very interested and they would be sending me a telegram. And I got a telegram saying, "Delighted to have you. Can you come to Monza to test the machine? Giuseppe Gilera." So this was really a turn up to the book. I then had to get on to David Brown of Aston Martin and ask him would he release me from my contract with Aston Martin. He was very understanding. I said, well, I'd realised after my ride at Silverstone that 2 wheels were for me rather than 4, and would he release me from the contract, which he agreed to do, which was very kind of him. Anyway, I went out to Monza, tried the bike. Quite a few problems. It made a very rapid gear change. It was going through the gear into the next neutral, which was a bit disconcerting, and the handling was very ordinary by Norton standards anyway. There was no time to do very much. He suggested a small modification to the gearbox, which did help, but didn't cure the problem. And of course we went straight into the TT. And because of what had happened with Gilbert Smith, I was very anxious to win the TT. But we had all sorts of problems in practice, mainly with the handling. I did 13 standing start laps in practice, trying to sort out the rear suspension. Some Italian shock absorbers were as hard as a rigid frame, and some German ones which we had would start off okay, but after we'd done a few miles there was no damping in them virtually. And one very disconcerting problem was that when this happened, round a place like H Cottage, which was very bumpy and very fast, and because the bottom of the engine, the Gilera was rather wide and the exhaust pipes were outside the actual sun, the exhaust pipes would ground, and they weren't megaphones, they were just straight through pipes, and they used to lift the back wheel off the ground. And that was, I don't know, probably 120 miles an hour. That was pretty disconcerting, to say the least. So one had to make allowances like this. Anyway, I decided that my tactics for the race would be to try and do a really shattering first lap. Main problem being, I thought Les Graham on the MV. Anyway, Les unfortunately crashed in that race and was killed, but I did my really rapid first lap, and I think I got something like 38 seconds lead at the end of that one lap, which was very encouraging, to say the least. I eventually caught up and passed Ray Am, who was then the #1 in the Norton team. And I hadn't come across Ray before, and really following Ray for a while, in particular because what happened was after I passed him, after a while I'd miss a gear change and he would come out of my slipstream and repass me. So I was spending quite a bit of time behind Ray, and that was really the most frightening experience I'd ever had, I think. Because Ray was the most lurid rider. I mean, places like most of you probably won't know it, but there's a series of left-hand bends which are very nearly flat out on the mountain, the 32nd mile. And you take these 3 bends in one continuous sweep, but it does involve some variation in line. And on one lap, there's a fence on the outside, then it goes onto the moorland, and there's about that much grass also before you get to the fence where the road finishes. On one lap, Ray was actually on that little bit of grass, doing probably about 120 miles an hour. And following this apparition was really, really something, you know. And anyway, Ray actually stopped fuel at the end of the 3rd lap. I was still obviously leading the race, but having an increasing problem with this gearbox. And I was fortunately going on to the next lap before I refueled, so I decided I must do a quick lap, refuel and get away again before Ray appeared. And of course he wasn't able to slipstream me anymore, so there was a good chance of doing that. Of course I rushed down Bray Hill, went into Porterbridge, wound it on a bit too hard, and the back came round, and then of course the 4-cylinder engine had very little flywheel compared to the normal. Made the mistake of snapping the throttle shut. The bike just lifted up like this, went into a lot wobble and threw me off. I picked myself up, rushed to the bike, picked it up. There didn't seem to be anything obviously wrong at the time. But the bottom of the fuel tank was shaped so you could rest your forearms on it, just for comfort really. And this had ground away on the road surface, which was down to chippings in those days. And of course split the tank and all the fuel had come out, so I was unable to continue. Anyway, the season itself went very well because once we got to the Continental Grand Prix, Genera had more than an edge on the north, and it was becoming more and more reliable, even if it didn't handle very well. And finished up with the championship in '53. An interesting thing, which I'd like to go back to, which was really quite amusing, was in '52 at the Belgian Grand Prix, where we used to check the carburation at the end of what we call the Master Straight, which was this bend stabilo, which I mentioned, this long right-hand, almost flat-out sweeping bend. And we used to practice first, and then when the practice was over, we used to park the bike, finish up there, park the bikes, and watch the sidecars go around. And Eric Oliver was, of course, the absolute kingpin in the cycle world at that time. And we always reckoned that Eric would go just as well with a bag of sand in the sidecar as he would with the passenger. But what we didn't know on this particular day was that Eric had arrived at the practice at the Belgian with no passenger. He was ill or something like that. So Eric, typical of him, wanders round the paddock looking for someone about the right size. And he eventually came across this American who was a journalist who'd never even been in an ordinary road-going sidecar outfit. And because he was there to cover the races, Eric somehow managed to talk him into going into the sidecar and the race outfit was practice. And he said, look, I don't want you to do anything. And we weren't aware of any of this, of course. We found this out afterwards. So I don't want you to do anything. Just lie in the nose of the sidecar and hold on. Whatever you do, hold on. I don't want you to do any acrobatics at all. So this, yes, all right, this is going to be good for the book, you know. And anyway, we parked, waiting for the first man to come round in the sidecar. And of course, this Stabler was flat out with it, and there were 600cc Nortons and sidecars in those days. They were really quite quick, even though they weren't streamlined. Anyway, we hear this Norton coming in the distance, and it was nearly always Eric anyway, you know, he was so quick off the line. And sure enough it was, and Eric comes sweeping around this, there's a slight right kink and an into Stablo, and no sign of his passenger, you see, so Eric's there, and of course, in those days, they didn't handle over well, these outfits. Handlebars were going like this, wobble on, you know. And I could see Eric looking down, and I realised that this passenger was gradually losing his grip. And Eric, without closing the throttle at all, takes one hand off the handlebars, gets hold of this chap by the seat of the breeches, and goes, whoo, like this. And then puts his hands back on the handlebars, still absolutely flat out, and disappears up the road. Oh, that's all we got. Anyway, process. And fortunately for this journalist, his proper passenger turned up in time for the race. I hate to think what it would have been like. I'm sure it would have been a nervous wreck. Anyway, he must have had a very good story for us. But that was just going back a bit anyway. Anyway, at the end of '53, I got to grips with Piero Taruffi, who was a very famous car driver, who was racing manager for Gilera, and talked out redesigning the Gilera to narrow the engine, lower it in the frame, etc. And during the winter, they literally redesigned the whole thing, and the actual steering geometry was modelled on the North, to be quite honest. The gearbox was all altered, and the engine, instead of being 2 inches above the wheel spindles, the crankshaft of the engine was 1 inch below, because they were able to narrow. And still nothing, you didn't catch the exhaust pipes on the ground or anything like that. And that machine handled so well that even at the TT, you didn't need a steering damper on it at all. Which really, I mean, even the Norton, you needed just a little steering damper. That stayed the TT. That's not on the continent of the TT. The Gilera genuinely didn't. In fact, we had a steering damper fitted for the TT, which I never used. And to save weight, what little it was, for the Continental Grand Prix, we actually had it taken off. It never wobbled or did anything untoward like that. And the 54 TT, I've always considered was my best possible chance of winning a senior TT before it had even happened, because that machine was absolutely outstanding. And I think, quite honestly, had the conditions been right, that machine would have gone round at 100 miles an hour. That was a year earlier than the debatable 100 miles an hour in 55. But of course, the weather conditions were absolutely atrocious when the race was started. It should never have been started. And then, of course, the race was stopped after I'd refueled, and Ram hadn't refueled at the end of the 4th lap, and the sun was shining, which was typical of what happens sometimes. Anyway, 54 was a marvellous season. 55, pretty well the same. But 55 at least gave me the opportunity of winning a senior TT, which really was the main thing. I mean, lots of people have asked me since, you know, how do you feel about not doing a 100-mile-an-hour lap, how important was it to you? I mean, it would have been nice to have done a 100-mile-an-hour lap, but the real thing I wanted to do was to win the race, and I managed to do that, which was quite satisfying as far as I was concerned. Anyway, then, I went to Australia one winter and to South Africa racing, and thoroughly enjoyed both those visits. And I always loved the travelling anyway. And then in 55 was of course, the big hoo-ha with the Dutch TT, where the private riders had an argument over starting money, and we, cut a long story short, supported them, and as a result, Reggie Armstrong and myself and several other riders had our licences rescinded for the following year, and we weren't able to ride until the Belgian Grand Prix in 1956. And I don't know, I often look back now and wonder whether, although I did what I did, I thought quite rightly in support of private riders, whether in fact it was the right thing to do. Because I seem to then run into a chapter of mishaps. Because the Belgian Grand Prix, I was leading the race from John Surtees, and a piston disintegrated. And this was rather unusual for me, because I never ever over-revved an engine, and I wondered how this could possibly have happened. But I was told afterwards that because at that time they didn't think I'd have much chance of the championship anyway, they put some light pistons in my engine just to see if it made any difference. And anyway, it did. The top came off the piston, and in fact the engineers told me later that they didn't find anything of the piston at all. It almost disappeared out of the exhaust pipe. Anyway, that was the start of my first race in '56. And then I went to the German Grand Prix at Solitude, which is a wonderful circuit, very interesting circuit, and always hundreds of thousands of people watching. In fact, again, going back to the '51 German Grand Prix, the first one after the war, there were over 400,000 people at that race at Solitude, which I think is the biggest crowd that's ever been at any motor or motorcycle race. Anyway, I went to Solitude in '56, and I had a big battle with Bill Lomas and the V8 Gutsy, and it was literally neck and neck. The bend after the start, Bill, I think, was giving a great demonstration of outbraking me, and he outbraked me 2 or 3 times going into this bend. But each time, because he was leaving his braking so late, he drifted out of it, and I was able to dive back inside it. But in spite of this, there was very little in it, and it was going to be anyone's race. And about 3/4 of the way through the race, and we must have been 3 minutes in front of Zella, it was, he was lying third. We were going down a very short straight, and suddenly clouds of steam came up of Bill Lomas' V8. One of the water pipes had burst, and he pulled in. And as he did that, my engine cut completely, the magneto ceased firing, and literally we both pulled into the side of the road and stopped, unable to do anything else. And I'm not sure whether Reggie Armstrong or Walter Zell still won the race. So that was the second race that John won by the board. So I was beginning to wonder whether perhaps I had done the right thing with those 2T. Anyway, then I went to the Ulster, which was on the New Dun Road circuit, and race day, it rained. And an absolute master rider in the wet was John Harper, who was on the Works North. So I thought, oh dear, this isn't going to be very good. And it didn't actually rain at the very beginning of the race, it was dry to start with. So we made a very good start, and went round a place called Levenstown Bridge, which was slowish, first gear, and the bike went into a slide. And this time I managed to avoid dropping it, unlike Porter Bridge. And when I went into the slide, John Harper came behind me, so I thought, oh dear. So anyway, I managed to get by again. And then we went about the third lap, went up over the top of the rise, what we call the Deer's Leap, and there's a drop down to a right-hand bend at the bottom. And literally just about where you start to brake, the bend at the bottom, was a line of water, rain, a line literally across the road. And I still don't know how I got round the bend, because obviously I couldn't brake in the same way that I could in the drive. And I thought, oh my God, this is it now, because John, being so good at the wet, and I knew he wasn't very, he was only just bleeding down my neck virtually. I thought, I'm going to have real problems now. Fortunately for me, I managed to scramble out of the bend, John just didn't. And John disappeared down the slip road and lost quite a bit of time. So eventually, I was able to settle down under these wet and slippy conditions, and I was quite enjoying the ride. And with about 3 laps to go, round Levenstown Bridge again, and the front just went completely from under me. Down I went, and John won the race. So that was 2 races on the trot, which had gone wrong. Then the final race was at Monza, where I had a terrific battle with Liberati and managed to beat him by about a machine's length. But of course, John Surtees won the championship because he'd been successful in some of the earlier races. And I was literally nowhere in beat at all. And then, of course, I started off badly in '57 because when I rode at Imola at 350 and the 500. I fell off the 350 on someone's oil. The flag marshal wasn't out quick enough, and some oil had been dropped on the surface and dropped the 350. Went out on the 500, made a bad start, and in my efforts to catch Bob McIntyre and Liberati, who were leading the race, I was gradually catching them up. I wound it on too hard, coming out of a rather bumpy right-hand bend, and dropped it again. So that was twice in one race, and dislocated my collarbone at the same time. So this literally put me out of racing until the Ulster. And somehow I never really got back into my stride that year. In fact, I think my best effort was a second place at Monza. And then at the end of that year, the Motor Guzzi, Gilera, Mondial, and officially MV decided they would stop racing, but then MV reneged on that agreement to continue racing in 58 and afterwards. And I just carried on then riding. I rode a 250 Pendennis for a while. I rode an experimental 350, which I more or less built myself with a little outside firing engine. And still quite enjoying racing, but obviously not very competitive. And finally, I rode the BMW for a while, which was a machine, quite honestly, a really fine machine, but I just couldn't get on with it. And in 59, I carried on riding a bike, my own 350 and a 500 that belonged to Rex. And I came eventually to the last race of the season at Locarno in Switzerland. And this involved a very short circuit in the middle of Locarno, crossing tram lines, very, very bumpy, mainly slow bends, not very, very fast ones. And I was riding my own 350, Dearden's 500, and the 250 Works Pinelli there. And anyway, I think the 350 race came first, and I won that reasonably comfortably. Then I rode the 500, and in total that day I did 170 odd laps around the circuit, which was rather a lot at the best of times. Anyway, I rode the 500, and I had a comfortable lead at one stage. Eventually, I was beginning to get a bit worn out, and also the heat from the megaphone had burnt a hole right through the heel of my right boot, and I finished up with a blister the size of my heel. My hands were all blistered. And on the last lap, or last couple of laps, I just had to ease up a bit. And eventually, Hocking, who was later to do so well with MVs, caught me up and tried to pass me on the last but one bend. Didn't quite make it. I beat him across the line literally by half a machine's length. And then, of course, I got to ride this 250 Benelli, which was a bit, the wrong way around. I went to Benelli and said, look, if you don't mind, I'd rather not ride. But they were so upset. They said, look, just start, and if you don't feel like it, then stop, you see. So I said, oh, all right. So anyway, it started off, and the other Benelli rider was leading the race, a chap called Rossetti. I was lying second, and feeling pretty second-hand. Anyway, much to my amazement, Rossetti throws it away on the one fast bend on the circuit, and I find myself in the lead. So you can't stop when you're in the lead, can you? So I carried on and won the race. So I'd won the 250, 350, 500, and I was absolutely won out. It had become an effort racing, I decided. And I just decided then that that would be my last race. And even my wife didn't know that I was even thinking about it. I didn't know I was even thinking about stopping. And but it just happened like that. And well, literally that was it. That was the end of my race.